Thanks for watching. When this channel hits 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a special giveaway, and one lucky new subscriber will win an iPhone 15 Pro Max. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss your chance. I was already living on the ship before the world ended, long before anyone started using words like outbreak or collapse. My contract was simple on paper. Night maintenance support for preservation work, monitoring humidity levels, checking sealed compartments, logging corrosion along interior bulkheads. The USS Missouri wasn't operational anymore, but she was far from dead. Steel still shifted with temperature. Old systems still breathed through vents and ducts. Someone had to be there when the tourists went home and the harbour lights dimmed. Most nights, it was just me and the ship. The last ferry would pull away, the water settling back into a slow, rhythmic slap against the hull. Footsteps echoed differently once the crowds were gone. Every sound carried. Every space felt larger. I slept in a narrow compartment below deck, a place that had once held sailors packed shoulder to shoulder. Alone, it felt cavernous. People think of the Missouri as a monument, frozen in time. Living aboard her taught me otherwise. She was a machine built for war, layered with redundancy and purpose. Thick steel doors sealed tight. Ladders rose vertically through the ship like arteries. Hatches could be dogged shut in seconds. Even stripped of weapons and crew, the design still demanded discipline. You learned quickly where noise travelled, which decks amplified sound, which spaces swallowed it whole. My routine never changed. I logged environmental readings every 4 hours. I walked inspection routes through familiar corridors, counting steps, noting smells, feeling for vibrations through the soles of my boots. Salt and moisture are relentless in Hawaii. Left alone, they eat everything. Keeping the ship stable was a constant fight against slow decay, not something dramatic, just patient and unavoidable. Pearl Harbor at night had its own rhythm. Distant engines hummed from the base. Planes passed overhead on predictable schedules. Lights moved across the water as security boats made their rounds. The Missouri sat moored and immovable, tied to the pier like a giant refusing to drift. From the upper decks, I could see the shoreline glowing softly, hotels and streets alive with normal life. I liked the separation. When your workday ends with silence instead of traffic, your thoughts slow down. The ship imposed order. Every passageway had a purpose. Every space existed for a reason. I trusted that. I trusted steel more than people. I kept minimal personal belongings on board. A duffel with clothes, tools, notebooks, and a portable radio. Food came from supply lockers meant for maintenance crews, supplemented by what I brought in weekly. Water was regulated and logged. Nothing was wasted. Living aboard a battleship teaches you to respect limits. There were rules about staying overnight, exceptions granted because of the work. I knew which alarms were active and which ones were ceremonial. I knew how long it took security to respond if something tripped after hours. Those details mattered to me even then, before they mattered to everyone else. Looking back, I realize how prepared the ship made me without trying. It taught me to move deliberately, to think in compartments and access points, to plan for failure instead of assuming stability. At the time, it just felt like a job. A quiet one. I had no idea that this floating relic, anchored in a peaceful harbour, was about to become the only place that still made sense when everything else stopped. The history surrounding the ship never weighed on me the way it did on visitors. They talked about surrender ceremonies and turning points. I thought about insulation, drainage, and how quickly a sealed door could change a situation. Living there stripped the romance away. What remained was function. Steel either held or it didn't. Systems either worked or failed quietly. I learned to pay attention to small shifts because ships give warnings long before they break. That habit stayed with me. It shaped how I listened, how I watched. how I waited. When the first signs of trouble appeared beyond the harbour, I noticed them the same way I noticed corrosion. Slowly, without panic, and with the understanding that ignoring them would eventually cost me. I wrote everything down. The first irregularities didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. They slipped in quietly, small enough to ignore if you weren't paying attention. One evening, the harbour channel carried less traffic than usual. The boats that normally cut across the water after sunset were missing, leaving long stretches of darkness where movement should have been. I noticed because the reflections were wrong. Light behaved differently when nothing disturbed the surface. My radio check came back delayed. Not static, not failure, just a pause that lingered longer than it should have. When the reply finally came through, the voice on the other end sounded measured, clipped, as if each word had been weighed before release. No explanation followed. I logged it and moved on, assuming a technical hiccup somewhere between shore and ship. The next morning, the supply run I expected never arrived. No notice, no call, no reschedule. By afternoon, an email appeared in my inbox with a single line about postponements due to temporary operational constraints. It read like something copied and pasted without care. I printed it anyway, folding the paper into my notebook out of habit. Security drills increased without announcement. Gates stayed closed longer. Access points that normally reopened within minutes remained sealed until well after their scheduled times. When I asked a guard I recognized, he shrugged and said protocols were being adjusted. He didn't elaborate. He didn't meet my eyes. Outside the harbour, the city still functioned, but the edges were fraying. Sirens carried farther at night. Helicopters traced unfamiliar paths overhead, cutting across the sky without lights. News screens in common areas cycled through generic updates that said nothing specific, repeating phrases about containment and public safety. The lack of detail bothered me more than bad news would have. I began cross-checking information during my rounds. Local stations contradicted national reports. Timelines didn't line up. One channel showed images from the mainland that felt older than the date stamp suggested. Another abruptly cut away from a live segment mid-sentence. I didn't know what to believe, so I stopped trying to form conclusions and focused on patterns instead. The Missouri felt unchanged, but the world around her shifted in subtle ways. The ferry schedule tightened, tour groups thinned, then vanished altogether. A normally crowded pier sat empty under the sun, ropes swaying lightly where people should have been. I stood there longer than necessary, watching nothing happen. A notice appeared restricting overnight departures for non-essential personnel. It was posted without explanation, the kind of order that assumes compliance rather than understanding. I reread it several times, then added a note to my log. Restrictions like that don't come from nowhere. They're reactions. That night I heard shouting from shore, not loud, not sustained, just brief bursts that cut through the air before disappearing. Sound travels differently over water. I couldn't place the source, only the direction. When it stopped, the quiet returned too quickly, like a door closing. I checked my equipment twice before sleeping. Batteries were full. Tools accounted for. Nothing missing. It was a pointless exercise, but it gave my hands something to do while my thoughts circled. I slept lightly, waking at intervals without knowing why. By the end of the week, the patterns were impossible to dismiss. Movement decreased. Communication slowed. Information fractured. Nobody said the word everyone was thinking. They didn't have to. Systems don't fail all at once. They drift first, misaligning piece by piece, until the gap becomes visible. Standing on deck one evening, I watched the sun drop behind the shoreline, the harbour painted in muted colours. Everything looked intact. That was the unsettling part. When collapse finally announces itself, it's already late. What I was seeing felt like the moment just before that announcement, when the air holds its breath and waits. The confirmation didn't come through a broadcast or an alert. It arrived as an absence. I woke to a harbour that should have been active and wasn't. No ferry engines, no maintenance crews, no voices carrying across the water. The ship felt heavier that morning, not physically, but in the way quiet settles when something has been removed rather than added. I attempted to check out through the usual channels and received no response. The radio stayed silent beyond automated acknowledgements. When I moved topside, I saw the gates at the pier sealed shut. Heavy barriers slid into place that were never meant to stay closed during normal operations. A patrol boat sat farther out than usual, stationary, its presence more symbolic than practical. By midday, an official notice finally came through. Civilian movement was suspended indefinitely. Non-essential personnel were instructed to shelter in place and await further guidance. The language was careful, sanitized, stripped of urgency. It said nothing about duration, nothing about what was happening beyond the perimeter. The omissions said more than the words. I had a choice then, even if it didn't feel like one. I could attempt to leave before enforcement tightened, or I could remain aboard and wait. I walked the length of the deck while I thought it through, boots ringing against steel. Leaving meant uncertainty, crowds, routes I didn't control. Staying meant isolation, limited resources, and a structure I understood completely. I trusted the ship. I didn't trust whatever waited beyond the harbour. The decision settled, without drama. I secured my belongings, consolidated supplies, and began treating the Missouri as a closed system. Hatches were checked, access points logged. I shut down areas I didn't need, narrowing my footprint to reduce noise and conserve energy. The ship responded the way it always had, silent and reliable. From the upper deck, I watched the shoreline change character. Smoke rose in thin columns from places that shouldn't have been burning. Emergency vehicles clustered at intersections, then vanished. Helicopters passed overhead at irregular intervals, flying low and fast. I counted them until I lost track. As daylight faded, the base lights along the harbour dimmed earlier than usual. Some went dark entirely. The patrol boat departed without replacement. The water between the ship and shore became an empty buffer, reflecting only what little light remained. I realized how exposed the Missouri would be if anyone tried to reach her, and how difficult it would be for them to succeed. That night I sealed myself below deck. Not out of fear, but practicality. Sound carries upward. Light travels farther than you think. I chose spaces designed to be enclosed, areas meant to isolate damage during combat. The irony wasn't lost on me. A ship built for war had become a refuge from something far less defined. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake listening to the ship's subtle noises, familiar creaks and distant metallic ticks as temperatures shifted. Those sounds grounded me. They were constant, predictable. Outside, something banged against the pier, loose and unmanned, repeating at uneven intervals until it finally broke free and drifted out of earshot. Sometime before dawn, the emergency broadcast system activated briefly, long enough to push out a truncated message before cutting off mid-sentence. I didn't hear the rest. I didn't need to. Whatever structure had been holding things together was already giving way. By morning, Pearl Harbor was closed in every sense that mattered. The Missouri stood isolated, tied to a pier no one approached. I took inventory again, slower this time, more deliberate. This wasn't a delay anymore. It was a boundary. When I finished, I wrote one line in my log and underlined it twice. I am staying aboard. The ship had already given me distance, elevation, and control. I didn't know how long that would last, but I knew this. Stepping off would mean surrendering all three at once. As the sun rose over the harbour, lighting empty water and locked gates, the USS Missouri stopped being a workplace. It became a line I wasn't willing to cross back over. I woke with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The ship was no longer a place I happened to be. It was a structure I had chosen, and that distinction mattered. I started by walking every accessible deck, not out of habit this time, but with intent. I traced routes the way water would, the way sound would, the way a body would move if it didn't know where it was going. The Missouri offered advantages immediately. Access points were limited by design. Gangways could be raised. Vertical ladders forced single-file movement. Bulkheads broke the ship into defensible compartments, each one capable of being isolated without affecting the others. I marked these transitions mentally, deciding which spaces would remain open and which would be surrendered if needed. I began closing the ship inward. Doors that once existed for convenience were dogged shut. Hatches that led nowhere essential were sealed and logged. I chose a primary living zone below deck, away from exterior walls and direct lines of sight. From there I established fallback areas, each one smaller than the last, creating layers instead of relying on a single safe room. Noise discipline came next. Steel carries sound aggressively. A drop tool could echo through multiple decks if you weren't careful. I wrapped contact points with cloth where I could. I moved loose equipment into storage, securing it so nothing shifted when the ship rocked. Even my footsteps changed. I learned where to step, to keep vibrations contained. Lighting required just as much thought. At night, any glow could be seen from shore if it reached an opening. I shut off unnecessary fixtures and rerouted myself through darker paths. Redundant lights were taped over. I tested reflections on water from different angles, adjusting until the ship blended into the harbor's natural darkness. Observation mattered, but exposure was a risk. I selected vantage points that allowed me to see without being seen, positions tucked behind structural elements where movement wouldn't silhouette me against the skyline. From there I could monitor docks, piers, and the waterline without announcing my presence. I resisted the urge to fortify everything. Overbuilding wastes energy and attention. Instead, I focused on denial. Making the ship difficult to approach was more effective than trying to make it impenetrable. Height alone handled most threats. Distance handled the rest. By the time I finished, the Missouri felt different. Not abandoned, not alive, but intentional. Every open space had a reason. Every closed space had a purpose. I documented the changes carefully, not because anyone would read them, but because consistency prevents mistakes. I created a written access map, not detailed enough to help an outsider, but clear enough to guide me under stress. It listed vertical routes first, then horizontal ones, prioritizing descent over ascent. Movement downward is quieter, slower, and easier to abandon. I staged tools along these paths, minimal and functional, so nothing had to be carried farther than necessary. Food storage areas were separated from sleeping quarters. Smell travels, and I wanted layers between me and anything that might follow it. Waste disposal was redirected to sealed containers, removed from airflow routes. Hygiene became procedural rather than casual. Every routine reduced risk in small, cumulative ways. I practiced transitions repeatedly, moving from one zone to another without light, closing hatches by feel alone, timing how long it took to secure a corridor from the moment I heard a sound. These rehearsals weren't drills in the traditional sense. They were confirmations that my assumptions matched reality. When I finally stopped, it wasn't because everything was perfect. It was because further changes would complicate what already worked. Complexity creates failure points. Simplicity holds longer. I sat in the quiet I'd shaped and listened. The ship answered back with nothing more than the steady, reassuring language of metal at rest. Once the ship was divided into controlled spaces, I turned my attention to what would keep me alive inside them. Shelter without sustenance is just a delay, and I didn't intend to guess how long this would last. I approached supplies the same way I approached the ship itself, by stripping away assumptions and working only with what I could verify. Food came first. The Missouri wasn't stocked like an active vessel, but maintenance crews required provisions, and those stores were scattered across multiple lockers. I consolidated everything into a single inventory, categorizing by shelf life rather than convenience. Canned goods were obvious priorities, but I paid equal attention to packaging integrity. Salt air finds weaknesses quickly. Anything compromised was separated and marked for early use. Nothing questionable stayed in rotation. Rationing wasn't about deprivation. It was about predictability. I calculated intake based on exertion, not comfort, adjusting portions to match workload rather than appetite. Heavy labor days demanded more calories. Quiet days required restraint. I wrote the numbers down and followed them without negotiation. Decisions made ahead of time removed temptation later. Water mattered more. The ship's potable systems were functional but not designed for indefinite isolation. I traced supply lines carefully, identifying storage capacity, filtration stages, and potential failure points. Fresh water reserves were finite. I reduced usage immediately, shifting to sponge cleaning and reuse protocols wherever possible. Every liter saved extended options I didn't yet need. Power presented a different challenge. Emergency generators existed, but fuel access was limited and replacement non-existent. I treated electricity as a tool, not a default. Lighting stayed minimal. Devices were charged in cycles, then disconnected. I logged runtimes obsessively, learning how long each system could operate before drawing too much attention or draining reserves beyond recovery. The ship itself offered passive advantages. Thick steel moderated temperature swings. Interior compartments stayed cooler during the day, warmer at night. I adjusted my schedule around that, working during periods when environmental stress was lowest, resting when heat or humidity peaked. Fighting the ship would have wasted energy. Working with it conserved it. Waste management forced uncomfortable discipline. There were systems for removal, but they relied on infrastructure that might not remain reliable. I adapted quickly, sealing refuse in layers and relocating it away from airflow routes. Odor control wasn't cosmetic. Smell carries, and I couldn't afford to advertise my presence. I documented everything. Not in flowing prose, just clean lists and measurements. Quantities, locations, limits. Documentation creates clarity under pressure. It also reveals patterns you miss when guessing. After several days, I could tell how long a power cycle would last without checking a gauge. Familiarity replaced uncertainty. What surprised me most was how quickly my needs narrowed. Comfort dropped away without resistance. Efficiency took its place. I stopped thinking in terms of meals and started thinking in intervals. Hours of light, days of water, weeks of food. The numbers grounded me. I avoided the mistake of optimism. Planning for rescue wastes time when rescue isn't guaranteed. I planned instead for continuation. What could be maintained without external input? What could be repaired with what I had? What failure would force movement? Each answer fed into the next decision. When I finished the initial assessment, nothing felt abundant. That was good. Abundance breeds carelessness. Scarcity sharpens attention. I secured the logs, stored them where I could reach them in darkness, and moved back into the controlled interior of the ship. The Missouri held what I needed for now. The question wasn't whether it was enough. The question was how long I could make it stay that way without inviting problems I couldn't solve. By the time I accepted how quiet the harbor had become, silence had turned into information. It told me where activity no longer existed and where absence had settled into permanence. From the forward deck, I watched the water stretch unbroken from pier to pier, interrupted only by drifting debris that had slipped free from unattended lines. The air carried no voices, no engines, no cadence of routine. Even the birds seemed confused, circling without committing to land. I adjusted my observation schedule to daylight and dusk, when changes were easiest to detect. Through binoculars scavenged from a locker, I mapped the shoreline in sections, noting stalled vehicles, open doors, and smoke stains that marked places where fires had burned out on their own. At night, I limited myself to brief checks, counting light sources rather than searching for detail. Each darkened building felt heavier than a damaged one. The harbour itself changed character. Boats that had once been secured began to wander, nudged by tide and wind until they bumped softly against docks or each other. The sounds were irregular, never rhythmic enough to become background noise. I learned to identify which impacts were harmless and which meant something new had entered the water. None of it felt immediate, but all of it felt directional. I saw people eventually, though never close. Small figures moved along the far edges of the base, cautious and scattered. They avoided open ground, travelling in short bursts before freezing to listen. I didn't signal. Movement attracts movement, and I couldn't control what followed it. Watching without participating felt cold, but it kept the ship quiet. Fires became rarer as days passed. When one appeared, it burned longer, fed by neglect rather than intention. Smoke rose straight up without interference from response crews. That told me more than any broadcast could have. Systems designed to react had stopped doing so. What remained was whatever individuals could manage on their own. I noticed the waterline most of all. Reflections changed as lights failed, in clusters rather than individually. A pier would glow one night and disappear the next, leaving a black gap where activity used to be. The Missouri sat among those changes like a fixed reference point, making loss easier to measure. I began logging silence the way I logged supplies, hours without movement, nights without sound beyond wind and water, mornings without aircraft. When a distant explosion rolled across the harbour one afternoon, it stood out precisely because nothing else had happened for so long. The echo lingered, then dissolved, leaving no follow-up. By the end of the second week, the conclusion was unavoidable. Whatever coordination had once held Pearl Harbor together had dissolved beyond my reach. The ship was isolated not by distance, but by decision, both mine and everyone else's. Water protected me from crowds and carried threats equally well. It was a boundary I could not cross unnoticed. I stopped looking for signs of recovery and focused instead on stability. Observation shifted from curiosity to maintenance. The harbour wasn't a place anymore. It was a condition. Understanding that changed how I planned. Waiting for normalization became pointless. Adaptation became the only sensible posture. On the final evening before I sealed off the upper decks for good, I stood at the rail and let the quiet settle fully. The Missouri did not respond to the absence around her. She floated, patient and indifferent, exactly as she had the day before. That constancy mattered. It told me I still had time, and time, properly used, was the only advantage left. I revised my perimeter assumptions accordingly, treating the surrounding water as both moat and mirror. Anything approaching would be visible long before it arrived. Yet anything I projected outward would travel just as far. I adjusted schedules, reduced checks, and conserved attention for moments that mattered. The harbour no longer promised answers, only signals. I accepted that exchange. From then on, my focus narrowed to what I could influence: position, timing, and restraint. Everything else belonged to the silence I had already measured and learned to respect. It shaped every choice I made afterwards, quietly reinforcing patience, caution, and deliberate survival habits. The first attempt didn't sound like an attack. It sounded like confusion. I was reviewing inventory logs when a hollow thump carried across the water, distant enough to blend with the harbour's usual echoes. I ignored it at first, assuming debris had struck a pier. A few minutes later, it came again, closer this time, followed by a faint scraping noise that dragged instead of bounced. I moved without light, climbing toward a mid-level observation point I had already selected for moments like this. From there, I could see the dock running parallel to the ship's port side. A single figure stood at the edge, swaying slightly, arms lifting and dropping without rhythm. It leaned forward, pressed against the metal barrier, then fell back. The motion repeated, mechanical and patient. I stayed still. Height mattered here. The distance from dock to deck was just enough to deny access without tools or coordination. The figure tried again, fingers scraping uselessly against smooth steel, before losing interest and wandering away. It moved slowly, without direction, bumping into a mooring post before collapsing to its knees. More shapes emerged as the night stretched on. Not a group, not coordinated, just individuals drifting towards sound or light that no longer existed. Some entered the water, wading until buoyancy changed their movement. They reached for the hull without understanding why it wouldn't yield. Steel offers nothing to grip. I listened carefully, cataloguing sounds instead of reacting to them. Water displacement had a distinct rhythm. Contact with metal produced sharper notes. Vocalizations carried farther but lacked pattern. Each sound told me something about position and intent, even when intent was minimal. What struck me most was how ineffective they were. The ship's design defeated them without effort. No climbing surfaces, no handholds, no low points. The Missouri had been built to repel force, not curiosity, yet both failed against her. Watching it happen removed some of the abstract fear I'd been carrying. This wasn't an unstoppable wave. It was a problem governed by physics and access. That understanding didn't make me careless. I tracked their movement through the night, noting how long they lingered before drifting away. Some returned hours later, drawn by residual noise I hadn't accounted for. I adjusted accordingly, isolating sections that amplified vibration and limiting movement during peak hours of darkness. Near dawn, something different happened. A shape struck the hull hard enough to ring through the interior, not a scrape but a collision. I tensed, expecting escalation, but none followed. When I checked, I found a small boat, untethered, nudged by current until it hit steel. No one was inside. It bobbed there, tapping gently, an unintentional signal repeating at irregular intervals. I resolved that problem immediately, lowering a line and pulling the vessel into a dead zone where it could be secured without noise. Leaving it adrift would have invited attention I couldn't control. Once tied off, the harbour returned to its muted state. When daylight finally spread across the water, the figures were gone. No bodies remained near the ship. Nothing clung to the hull. The evidence existed only in my notes and the faint scuff marks where hands had failed to find purchase. I reviewed my assumptions carefully. Vertical separation worked. Distance worked. Silence worked most of all. The night had tested those principles without overwhelming them. That mattered. It meant the ship's defenses weren't theoretical. They had already functioned under real pressure. I modified my routines again, not drastically, just enough to account for what I'd learned. Movement during daylight. Stillness after dark. Tools staged farther from exterior walls. Observation limited to necessary intervals. Each adjustment reduced exposure by a fraction, and fractions add up. The intrusions didn't frighten me in the way I expected fear to feel. They clarified the shape of the threat. Knowing what couldn't reach me made it easier to focus on what might. The harbour had spoken during the night, not with chaos, but with data. I recorded it all, then closed the log and prepared for the next variable. Human movement appeared days after the infected proved predictable. It began with light where none should have been. A brief flash along the shoreline that vanished before I could orient on it. I dismissed it as reflection until it happened again, from a different position. Unlike the wandering shapes from earlier nights, this movement showed intent. I adjusted my schedule to watch longer during daylight, using shadow rather than darkness for concealment. Boats began to appear at a distance, not drifting but controlled. Oars dipped quietly. Motors stayed off. Whoever was out there understood sound the way I did. That made them more dangerous than anything that had reached for the hull. The first group circled the harbor edge without approaching the Missouri directly. They stopped near abandoned docks, scavenging in short, efficient bursts. I could tell from their pacing that they were conserving energy, not panicking. One of them pointed toward the ship, arm extended, then lowered it after a brief discussion I couldn't hear. They moved on without testing distance. I felt relief and unease at the same time. Being ignored meant safety for now. It also meant I had been evaluated and deemed either inaccessible or not worth the risk. That calculation could change quickly if circumstances did. I reviewed my exposure points again, focusing less on infected access and more on human capability. Rope, ladders, fire, tools. A coordinated effort could overcome height if given time. I removed anything from exterior decks that could be repurposed against me and altered my observation angles to avoid predictable patterns. At night, voices carried across the water in fragments. Not shouting, just conversation, punctuated by brief laughter that felt out of place against the silence. I stayed still and let the sound pass. Engaging would have revealed more about me than them. Days later, a single boat approached closer than the rest. It stopped well short of the hull, engines still silent. A man stood and raised his hands, palms out, performing a gesture older than language. He spoke, but the words blurred together before reaching me. I didn't respond. Communication creates expectation, and expectation invites pressure. He waited longer than I expected, then left without incident. No threats, no pleas, just withdrawal. That restraint unsettled me more than aggression would have. It suggested planning beyond the moment. I began tracking human patterns the same way I tracked supplies. Frequency, duration, direction. Their presence increased gradually, never clustering, never settling. They avoided areas where infected lingered, using sound to herd them away from access points. That level of coordination implied leadership and experience. The Missouri's isolation protected me, but it also marked me as a resource. Steel shelter, elevation, visibility. Anyone watching long enough would recognize that. I needed to remain unremarkable, not dominant. Dominance invites challenge. I changed my light discipline again, reducing checks to irregular intervals and abandoning upper deck movement during visible hours. I let the ship look dormant. A museum vessel without crew or power held less appeal than a defended position. The realization came quietly. Infected were obstacles, but people were variables. Obstacles behave consistently. Variables adapt. Survival depended on staying outside their calculations as long as possible. I didn't hate them. I understood them. In their position, I would have done the same evaluation. That understanding didn't create sympathy. It created caution. By the end of the week, the harbor hosted two kinds of danger, each governed by different rules. One responded to physics, the other responded to opportunity. I could manage the first with structure, the second required invisibility. I updated my logs, not with fear, but with clarity. The Missouri remained secure for now, but the equation had changed. The water that separated me from the shore no longer guaranteed distance. It guaranteed observation in both directions. From that point forward, every decision had to account for the fact that someone, somewhere, was thinking about the ship the same way I was. I adjusted priorities accordingly, accepting that patience and restraint would matter more than strength, and that remaining unnoticed was now an active task requiring constant awareness and disciplined silence. At all times, the ship was never designed to hold one person for this long. That realization settled in slowly, not as panic, but as friction. Spaces built for crowds felt wrong when occupied alone. Corridors stretched longer. Rooms lost their scale. Without the noise of hundreds of bodies, every creak sounded intentional. Every vibration felt like a message meant for me. Routine became my anchor. I divided the day into blocks, assigning tasks whether they were necessary or not. Inspections happened on schedule. Logs were updated at fixed times. Meals followed the clock instead of hunger. Structure filled the gaps where conversation used to exist, giving the hours shape before they collapsed into each other. The ship responded to consistency. When I walked the same routes daily, I noticed changes immediately. A new stain along a bulkhead, a loose fitting vibrating differently than before. These details grounded me. They gave my attention somewhere to go besides inward. Isolation turns thoughts into feedback loops if you let it. I didn't. Sleep required adaptation. Without external markers, nights bled into mornings. I adjusted lighting gradually, simulating dusk and dawn inside the ship, training my body to recognize transitions even when the harbor offered none. Rest became something I managed rather than expected. I limited my exposure to observation after dark. Watching too much invited speculation I couldn't act on. Instead, I listened. Sound carried information without demanding interpretation. Water against steel, wind through rigging, the absence of engines. These cues reminded me that the world still operated under rules, even if systems had failed. There were moments when the scale of emptiness pressed in. Standing in a mess hall designed for hundreds, eating alone, felt like trespassing in someone else's memory. I learned to avoid those spaces, not because they frightened me, but because they distracted me. Nostalgia wastes energy. I kept myself small within the ship, occupying only what I needed. Unused areas stayed dark and silent, preserved in whatever state they had last been left. Containment applied to my movements as much as my defenses. The fewer variables I introduced, the fewer problems I had to solve. The Missouri carried history in every plate and weld, but I stopped thinking about that. Meaning complicates survival. Function simplifies it. I treated the ship like a tool, not a symbol. Tools don't judge. They either work or they don't. I spoke out loud occasionally, just enough to hear my own voice and confirm it still sounded steady. No conversations, no rehearsals. Just brief acknowledgements of actions taken or decisions made. The sound grounded me without creating dependency. Days passed without markers beyond my logs. The harbor remained quiet, the threats distant but present. I felt the strain of solitude most during inactivity, when nothing demanded my attention. To counter it, I introduced deliberate challenges, repairing non-critical components, reorganizing storage, testing access routes under low light. Effort kept my mind aligned with purpose. I understood then that survival here wasn't about defending against intrusion alone. It was about managing the space between events, the long stretches where nothing happened, and everything could unravel if I let it. The ship provided structure, but I had to supply discipline. By the time I finished refining my routines, the Missouri felt less like a refuge and more like a system I inhabited. Not comfortable, not hostile, just precise. That precision mattered. It kept my thoughts linear, my actions deliberate, and my presence quiet. Alone aboard a battleship never meant safety. It meant responsibility. As long as I maintained that, isolation remained a condition I could endure rather than a force that would eventually undo me. I marked the passing weeks by maintenance cycles instead of dates, measuring endurance through completed tasks rather than calendar promises. Each finished repair reinforced continuity, proving that effort still produced results. The ship didn't care about morale, only attention. Giving it that attention kept my thinking external, practical, and anchored. As long as there was something to inspect, tighten, clean, or document, my focus stayed forward. The moment I stopped, doubt crept in, subtle and corrosive, so I made sure there was always another task waiting. That rule became non-negotiable for me alone. By the time I shifted from maintenance to reinforcement, the ship had already taught me where it wanted to be defended. I didn't invent new strategies so much as follow existing lines. Warships are layered by necessity. Redundancy isn't decorative, it's structural. I let that logic guide every decision instead of forcing my own assumptions onto steel that had already outlasted generations. I began by redefining boundaries. Areas that once served convenience were stripped of that role. Ladders became choke points rather than access routes. I removed removable rungs where possible, lowering them only when needed, and securing them out of reach afterwards. Vertical movement was the most dangerous variable, so I limited it aggressively. Any ascent would require time, balance, and intent, all things I could detect before they reached me. Hatches received similar treatment. I evaluated each one for location, visibility, and consequence. Some were sealed permanently, logged as dead ends in my access map. Others were modified to close faster or louder, creating audible confirmation if they were disturbed. Silence was useful, but controlled noise had value when it warned, instead of revealed. I abandoned entire sections of the ship deliberately. Defensive depth matters more than coverage. By retreating from non-essential areas, I shortened the perimeter I had to manage and reduced the number of variables that could fail simultaneously. Darkness reclaimed those spaces, preserving them in stillness. If something moved there, I would know immediately because it would not belong. Observation points were refined rather than expanded. I chose positions that offered overlapping sightlines without requiring frequent movement. From those places, I could see approach routes indirectly, using reflections and shadows instead of direct exposure. The goal wasn't dominance. It was awareness without presence. I staged tools sparingly. Excess equipment creates clutter, and clutter slows response. Each defensive zone received only what was necessary to hold it or abandon it safely. Nothing decorative, nothing redundant. Everything had a clear purpose and a clear limit. The ship's height remained my strongest ally. Anything approaching from the water had to commit long before reaching the hull. I reinforced that advantage by eliminating visual cues that suggested occupancy. No lights, no movement silhouettes. From a distance, the Missouri looked inert. Just another massive object left behind. I tested my zones repeatedly, moving through them under different conditions. No light, partial light, simulated stress. I timed transitions and recorded bottlenecks, adjusting layouts until movement felt inevitable rather than rushed. Panic creates noise. Predictable paths prevent it. Sound control extended beyond my own actions. Loose cables were secured. Metal contact points were isolated. Anything that could vibrate under wind or tide was dampened or removed. The quieter the ship remained, the less likely it was to invite investigation. I considered fire risks carefully. Steel doesn't burn, but everything inside it can. I removed flammable materials from defensive corridors and staged extinguishers where they wouldn't require crossing open space to reach. Fire isn't just destructive. It's visible. Visibility was unacceptable. I resisted the temptation to over-fortify. Excess barriers create confidence that isn't earned. I needed flexibility more than strength. If a zone failed, retreat had to be clean. If I was forced to move quickly, the ship needed to guide me instead of trapping me. The Missouri's interior began to feel different as these changes settled. Not heavier, not more dangerous, but sharper. Purpose replaced neutrality. Every passage had intent. Every closure told a story about what mattered and what didn't. When I finished, I stepped back mentally and walked the ship in my head, tracing routes without moving. That exercise revealed gaps I hadn't noticed physically. I adjusted those last details quietly, then stopped. The ship was no longer just shelter. It was a layered decision, reinforced by constraint and clarity. Anything that reached me would have to pass through multiple choices I had already made. That mattered more than walls. I logged the final configuration and set a rule for myself. No further changes unless new information demanded them. Constant modification signals uncertainty. Stability builds confidence, even if it's borrowed from structure rather than circumstance. That night I listened from within the reinforced interior and heard nothing that didn't belong. The absence of intrusion wasn't proof of success, but it was confirmation of balance. The Missouri didn't need to be impenetrable. It needed to be difficult enough that nothing chose to test it. The infected and the living were not the only threats pressing against the ship. Time worked continuously, indifferent to intent, and the ocean accelerated its progress. Salt found every weakness eventually. It crept into seams, collected in corners, and settled into places no inspection checklist ever fully covered. The Missouri had endured decades of it, but neglect changes the equation. Without constant attention, decay stops being gradual. Weather became my primary adversary. Storms rolled in without warning, pushing wind across open decks and driving rain into spaces never meant to be sealed forever. I tracked forecasts when signals were available, but reliability faded quickly. When clouds gathered low and heavy, I prepared as if conditions would worsen rather than pass. Water intrusion demanded immediate response. Even small leaks matter on a ship. I traced moisture trails back to their sources, sealing what I could with improvised materials, rerouting drips into controlled containers when repair wasn't possible. Letting water choose its own path invites corrosion into structural spaces that cannot be easily accessed later. Humidity altered everything. Metal expanded differently from composite materials. Fasteners loosened. Panels creaked under stress that hadn't existed weeks earlier. I learned to recognize new sounds quickly, distinguishing between harmless shifts and warnings. Familiarity kept small problems from becoming large ones. The deck surfaces degraded first. Anti-slip coatings peeled under constant exposure, revealing steel beneath. I adjusted movement routes accordingly, avoiding slick areas during storms and marking hazards mentally rather than physically. Paint and tape degrade too. Memory proved more reliable. Power systems suffered under environmental strain. Connections oxidized faster than expected. I cleaned contacts regularly, sacrificing time and energy to preserve function. Losing power wouldn't just mean darkness. It would mean losing control over information and timing. That risk outweighed the cost of constant maintenance. Wind forced me to reconsider exterior storage. Items left unsecured became projectiles when gusts funneled between superstructure elements. I relocated everything movable into interior compartments, leaving decks as empty as possible. Empty spaces absorb stress better than cluttered ones. Storm noise introduced another variable. Rain against steel masks other sounds, reducing my ability to detect movement. During heavy weather, I sealed myself deeper within the ship and accepted reduced awareness rather than compensate with risky exposure. Visibility returns. Mistakes don't. Corrosion worked invisibly. I inspected known problem areas more frequently, paying attention to discoloration and texture changes rather than obvious damage. When steel flakes appeared, I documented them carefully. Structural failure rarely announces itself suddenly. It accelerates after long neglect. The ocean tested the mooring constantly. Tides shifted. Lines strained. I monitored attachment points closely, tightening and adjusting when conditions allowed. Losing the ship's position would have been catastrophic. Mobility without control is vulnerability. I began treating maintenance as defense. A functional structure resists intrusion better than any barrier. Rust weakens. Water erodes. Neglect invites collapse without requiring an enemy. Every repair preserved options, extending time. The storms also altered the harbor. Debris moved unpredictably, floating hazards drifting closer under wind pressure. I watched for impacts, prepared to respond if something struck the hull with enough force to draw attention or cause damage. Most collisions were minor, but patterns changed with weather. After each storm, I conducted full assessments, not immediately, but once conditions stabilized. Rushing inspections leads to missed details. I moved slowly, methodically, confirming what had held and what required attention next. Documentation followed action, not the other way around. The Missouri endured because she was designed to, but design alone doesn't guarantee survival. Effort does. I understood then that isolation didn't pause entropy, it concentrated it. Every day without intervention compounded decay. The realization sharpened my priorities. The ship didn't just need defending from external threats. It needed preservation against the environment that had always been eroding it quietly. Storms would come regardless of what happened on shore. Salt would continue its work. The only variable I controlled was how consistently I responded. When the weather cleared and the harbor settled again, the Missouri remained afloat, intact, and functional. That outcome wasn't accidental. It was earned through attention and restraint. As long as I could maintain that balance, the ship would remain more than shelter. It would remain usable time measured in effort rather than hope. Staying unseen required more than silence. It demanded restraint in moments when action felt justified. Each time I noticed movement near the harbor, instinct pushed me to observe longer, to confirm intent, to gather certainty. I learned quickly that certainty carries a price. The longer I watched, the more predictable my behavior became. Predictability is a signal, even when it feels passive. The ship's isolation protected me, but it also limited my margin for error. Supplies diminished slowly, not alarmingly, but enough to remind me that time was not neutral. Every day spent hidden extended safety while quietly shrinking options. I tracked that balance carefully, aware that avoidance alone does not sustain life indefinitely. I adjusted my routines to reduce detectable patterns. Inspections shifted in timing and order. Observation windows changed unpredictably. I avoided repeated paths when possible, even if they were efficient. Efficiency creates habit. Habit creates exposure. I accepted inconvenience as a form of camouflage. The mental cost arrived gradually. Silence stopped being restful and became dense. Without interaction, decisions echoed longer in my head. I countered that by externalizing thought through written planning. Not reflection, not journaling, just forward-facing lists and conditional scenarios. If this happens, then this follows. Writing prevented imagination from filling gaps with noise. Food choices became strategic rather than nutritional. I prioritized items that required minimal preparation, reducing sound and smell. Cooking heat was limited, timed during periods of ambient noise from wind or distant activity. Every choice reduced the ship's footprint in ways I could not see directly, but trusted mathematically. I abandoned several observation positions entirely. Knowing too much increased temptation. Temptation led to risk. I chose ignorance deliberately, allowing the harbor to exist beyond my awareness unless something forced itself into range. Survival isn't about information volume, it's about relevance. At night, I slept deeper inside the ship, even though exterior access offered better situational awareness. Distance mattered more than visibility. The Missouri's interior absorbed sound and insulated me from external variation. That insulation came with disorientation, but I preferred controlled uncertainty to exposed clarity. The decision to remain hidden carried moral weight I refused to analyze. Analysis leads to justification, and justification leads to compromise. I did not owe the world visibility. I owed myself continuity. That framing simplified choices that would have otherwise fractured me. Equipment wear increased under constant readiness. Batteries cycled more frequently, tools dulled. Nothing failed catastrophically, but everything aged faster under tension. I began rotating equipment more aggressively, accepting minor inefficiency to preserve redundancy. Redundancy matters most when nothing goes wrong. I rehearsed departure scenarios more often, not because I planned to leave immediately, but because knowing I could reduce psychological pressure. Planning is a release valve. It transforms anxiety into sequence. I mapped routes, staged gear, and then put it away again, content with preparedness rather than execution. Human presence along the shore grew more organized over time. Fires were controlled. Movement followed patterns. That meant leadership existed somewhere beyond my reach. Organized groups changed the landscape faster than chaos does. I understood that hiding from structure eventually becomes harder than hiding from disorder. The Missouri remained effective precisely because it appeared irrelevant. No lights, no signals, no signs of life. Maintaining that illusion cost energy and attention, but it delayed confrontation. Delay was valuable. Delay allowed decay to be managed, supplies to be stretched, and decisions to be deferred until conditions clarified. Eventually, I accepted that concealment was not a permanent state. It was a phase with a lifespan determined by factors I could influence but not control. That acceptance didn't weaken my resolve. It focused it. I stopped measuring success by how invisible I remained and started measuring it by how prepared I would be when invisibility failed. That shift changed how I viewed the ship. The Missouri was no longer just a hiding place. It was a staging ground, buying me time to choose my next move deliberately, rather than reactively. Remaining hidden had kept me alive, but it would not carry me forward forever. Recognizing that truth early prevented desperation later, I logged the assessment and adjusted plans accordingly, knowing that restraint had served its purpose and that adaptation would soon demand something different from me. The first signal wasn't obvious enough to confirm, which made it harder to ignore. I noticed it at dusk, a brief flare of light near the tree line beyond the docks, shielded carefully so it didn't spill outward. It wasn't fire. It lacked the wild movement of something unattended. The glow appeared, dimmed, then vanished in a controlled way. Whoever produced it understood visibility. I didn't react immediately. Acting on a single data point invites misinterpretation. Instead, I marked the position and waited. The next evening, the light returned in nearly the same place, this time paired with a second source further inland. The spacing felt deliberate, wide enough to suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Smoke followed later, thin and short-lived, rising straight up before dissipating. I adjusted my observation angle to confirm without exposing myself. Through binoculars, I identified structures that hadn't been occupied earlier. Tents arranged along a service road, debris cleared from pathways, reflective material hung low between trees. This wasn't scavenging, it was settlement behavior. Sound patterns changed as well. Instead of scattered movement, activity followed predictable intervals. Tools struck metal with rhythm. Voices carried in controlled bursts, ending abruptly rather than trailing off. Even at a distance, discipline has a signature. I recognized it from my own routines aboard the ship. The infected avoided the area. That mattered. Whatever group had established itself there knew how to redirect attention and maintain quiet. They weren't simply surviving, they were managing their environment. I considered signaling back and dismissed it just as quickly. Communication compresses distance, and distance was still my greatest asset. Engaging would shift the balance immediately, turning observation into negotiation. Negotiation requires leverage. I wasn't ready to reveal mine. Instead, I gathered information indirectly. I tracked the settlement's growth through environmental changes, expanded cleared zones, additional light sources, movement of boats between docks and shoreline. Their logistics were improving. That suggested numbers. Numbers change dynamics faster than weapons. I compared their position to my own limitations. Supplies aboard the Missouri remained adequate but finite. Maintenance demands increased with time. Isolation preserved safety but restricted renewal. The settlement offered resources I lacked, but access carried exposure I couldn't reverse. I began rehearsing scenarios again, this time with greater specificity. Contact at range, silent withdrawal, emergency departure under observation. I accounted for wind direction, water conditions, and approach vectors that minimize silhouette. Planning did not commit me to action. It prepared me to choose. The lights appeared more frequently as weeks passed, never random, never careless. At times, I wondered if they were meant to be seen, not by me specifically, but by anyone still watching. Signals don't always seek a particular recipient. Sometimes they announce existence. I thought about timing. Any group that survives long enough begins to expand outward, either intentionally or through necessity. Resource pressure forces movement. When that happened, the Missouri would become part of their calculations whether I wanted it to or not. I adjusted my routines to accommodate that future. Supplies were repacked for mobility rather than storage. Equipment selection narrowed to essentials that could be carried without noise. The ship remained my base, but I stopped treating it as permanent. Emotion stayed out of it. This wasn't about hope or fear. It was about trajectory. The shoreline settlement represented change, and change eventually intersects everything static. I could remain isolated and react later, or prepare now and control the terms when interaction became unavoidable. One evening, the lights flickered in a new pattern, briefly illuminating a reflective surface angled towards the harbor. It caught the last light of sunset, flashed once, then disappeared. It wasn't a message I could decode, but it confirmed intent. They knew someone might be watching from the water. I didn't respond. I logged the event, noted the time and direction, and closed the observation point for the night. Decisions didn't need to be immediate to be effective. They needed to be correct. As I returned to the ship's interior, the weight of the choice ahead settled without urgency. The Missouri had given me time, distance, and structure. The shore now offered possibility, risk, and renewal. Neither option was clean. Both demanded commitment. I slept knowing that isolation had reached its natural limit. The next phase would require movement, whether towards the shore or away from it entirely. What mattered was not which path I chose, but that I chose it deliberately, with preparation rather than impulse guiding me. Once the decision shifted from possibility to preparation, my focus narrowed. Leaving the ship was no longer an abstract outcome. It became a sequence of tasks that had to be completed without haste or error. I didn't rush. Rushed departures carry assumptions, and assumptions collapse under pressure. I began by reducing my footprint even further. Anything that could not travel with me was evaluated for future use. Some supplies were staged for return, sealed and logged in compartments I knew would remain stable. Others were redistributed to support a clean exit, ensuring nothing essential was buried behind locked spaces or unnecessary detours. The ship needed to remain usable, whether I came back in days or never returned at all. Gear selection required restraint. Carrying capacity imposes discipline. I chose tools that solved multiple problems rather than specialized ones. Cutting, fastening, illumination, navigation, water purification. Each item justified its weight by replacing at least 2 others. Redundancy existed only where failure would be catastrophic. Clothing followed the same logic. Layers that dried quickly, neutral colors that broke outline without drawing heat. Footwear that gripped wet surfaces and could be removed without noise. Nothing new, nothing untested. Familiarity reduces hesitation when conditions deteriorate. I mapped departure routes repeatedly, walking them in silence at different times of day. Tide levels mattered. Wind direction mattered. Reflection angles mattered. I identified moments when the harbor offered cover rather than exposure, windows measured in minutes rather than hours. Those windows would dictate timing more than any internal schedule. The boat I had secured earlier became central to the plan. I inspected it thoroughly, reinforcing weak points and removing anything that rattled or reflected light. Oars were padded at contact points. Fuel was divided into smaller containers to prevent catastrophic loss. Balance was tested with load, then tested again. A vessel that behaves unpredictably under stress is a liability. I staged equipment along the exit route in reverse order: last use items closest to departure, first use items deepest inside. That sequence prevented backtracking and reduced decision-making during execution. When movement begins, thinking must already be finished. I prepared contingency plans without committing emotionally to any of them. Abort points were identified and respected. If observed before clearing the harbor, I would retreat. If approached mid-crossing, I would divert. If the shore proved inaccessible, I would disengage entirely. None of these outcomes felt like failure. They were adjustments. The Missouri itself required closure. I secured compartments methodically, sealing spaces in a way that preserved internal balance and reduced environmental intrusion. I left markers only I would understand, subtle indicators of status rather than obvious signs of presence. The ship didn't need to look abandoned, it needed to look unchanged. Before finalizing the plan, I conducted one last full systems check. Power was reduced to baseline, water storage secured, no leaks unattended, no hazards unresolved. Leaving a problem behind guarantees it will greet you later in worse form. Emotion surfaced briefly as I walked the deck at dusk. Not attachment, not sentimentality, but recognition. The ship had given me more than shelter. It had imposed discipline when the outside world lost it. Acknowledging that didn't slow me down. It clarified the standard I needed to maintain beyond her hull. I slept early that night, not because I was tired, but because rest improves execution. When I woke, I reviewed the plan one final time without changing anything. Changes at that stage introduced doubt. Departure would happen on conditions, not impulse. Light, tide, and activity would align, or they wouldn't. I accepted that waiting another day was preferable to forcing the moment. Preparation isn't about speed. It's about removing excuses for failure. When everything was ready, I didn't feel urgency. I felt quiet readiness, the kind that comes when all remaining uncertainty belongs to the world, rather than to you. The Missouri stood secured behind me, stable and patient, no longer a destination but a reference point. Whether I returned or not, it had served its purpose. The next phase would test what I carried forward from it. I waited until the harbor settled into its late morning lull, when movement thinned and heat pressed sound flat against the water. The boat slid free without protest, oars entering quietly where tide carried them instead of resisting. I kept my head low, eyes on reference points I had memorized for weeks. The ship receded in increments, not suddenly, her lines dissolving into geometry and shadow. I felt no rush, only focus. Distance accumulated with each stroke, measured by angles changing rather than meters traveled. The Missouri stayed still, allowing separation without comment. Nothing about the crossing demanded bravery, only patience. Halfway across, I paused and let the boat drift, checking reflections before committing again. Light revealed more than shape. It revealed intent. Shore activity followed patterns I could predict, and none intersected my line. I resumed movement, angling to keep glare behind me. Wind shifted briefly, carrying distant noise, then settled. I adjusted timing rather than speed, preserving quiet. Each correction reduced risk without adding effort. When the water deepened in color, I knew I had cleared the most exposed spans safely. The decision felt earned, controlled, and reversible, if conditions changed unexpectedly during withdrawal or return later, alone, unseen. Approaching shore reversed the problem. Cover replaced distance, but concealment narrowed. I beached the boat within shadow cast by mangroves and waited, listening for disruption my arrival might cause. Nothing responded. I moved inland slowly, carrying only what balanced mobility and necessity. Footing mattered. Dry ground amplified mistakes. I followed paths already cleared by others, avoiding fresh disturbance. Evidence of organization appeared immediately, orderly storage and marked boundaries. Whoever lived here planned beyond today, which changed how I evaluated every step from that point, prioritizing caution, restraint, and reversibility over speed, curiosity, or unnecessary confidence gained previously aboard ship. Alone. I did not approach the settlement directly. Instead, I circled wide, confirming perimeter behavior before deciding anything else. People moved with purpose, not panic, and their spacing suggested trust without complacency. That balance impressed me. I stayed downwind, using terrain to mask sound, and observed until I understood rhythms. When I finally stepped forward, it was into a space meant to be seen, hands empty, posture neutral. I stopped well short of voices and waited for response with measured breathing, eyes lowered, allowing them control, distance, timing, an initial narrative without pressure, urgency, or provocation from me at all times. The meeting itself was brief and deliberate. Questions were practical, answers concise, expectations stated plainly. I shared nothing unnecessary, offering context without leverage. They did the same. We stood separated by space that acknowledged risk without inflaming it. An agreement formed without ceremony. Observation would continue, interference would not. I withdrew first, maintaining the boundary I had established. Trust was not created, but parameters were. That was sufficient for the moment and preserved options on both sides while keeping consequences contained, future engagement conditional, and escalation unlikely unless provoked by scarcity, misinterpretation, or external pressure applied suddenly from elsewhere beyond. I returned to the water before dusk, reversing my route with the same discipline that brought me in. The boat accepted weight silently, and the tide assisted rather than hindered. I avoided looking back toward the settlement, keeping attention on balance and timing. Exposure shrank as distance grew. When the hull of the Missouri rose again from the water, it felt familiar without comfort. I secured the boat, climbed aboard, and restored concealment exactly as planned to prevent signals, curiosity, or pursuit from forming after contact, preserving ambiguity regarding origin, intent, and frequency of movement across harbor, waterline, routes, afterward. Standing alone on deck, I evaluated what had changed. The ship remained viable, but isolation was no longer absolute. I had crossed a threshold and returned intact, which altered future calculations. Knowledge replaced assumption. The next steps would require balance between engagement and distance, neither pursued fully. I documented outcomes, updated plans, and reduced activity again. The Missouri had carried me through containment. It would now support transition, provided I respected the limits that made it effective during changing conditions, uncertain alliances, and evolving pressures shaping survival beyond solitary endurance into negotiated coexistence or withdrawal depending on outcomes ahead. Soon.